Welcome to our 26th year, a quarter of a century of service to the worldwide amateur radio community. We are This Week in Amateur Radio, your all-amateur radio and technology news magazine and bulletin service of the air. This is edition number 1355 with a release and air date of Saturday, February 15, 2025. Please take the program to your air following the cue tone.
On the air around the world on the amateur radio bands and streaming on the internet since 1993. Our podcast serves the amateur radio community with weekly, amateur radio headline, news and special features. Welcome into This Week in Amateur Radio. We are the worldwide premier amateur radio and technology news magazine and bulletin service of the air. Here are the stories for release around the earth as we come to air with edition number 1355 of This Week in Amateur Radio. Rig Expert's administrative office complex is destroyed in a Russian missile attack. Actor Paul Giamatti is tapped to play the late Art Bell in an upcoming biopic film. The AM radio act to save AM radio in vehicles in the United States gets a newly revived effort. A large grant will help young amateur radio operators to become contesters. We will have the details. A prominent shortwave broadcasting site in Austria has been blown up. We will tell you about its demise. Sirius XM has a powerful new satellite in orbit. Scientists say that the magnetic North Pole has officially shifted positions. The Hurricane Watch Net and the League are both looking to train young net controls. The Amateur Radio Protection Act is reintroduced in Congress. We will tell you about it. The International Amateur Radio Union prepares to celebrate its centenary. Hams along the Indonesia-Bangladesh border are detecting suspicious signals. Remember that station that had its tower and transmitter stolen? We wrap up this story with WJLX returning to air. And, finally freed from all of its patents, the MP3 is now public domain. What will its future hold? We will take a close-up look at the MP3 in this week's report. These headline stories will come to you in a moment, along with this week's special features. We'll visit with Bruce Page, KK5DO, and get an update from AMSAT and what's new with all those amateur satellites in orbit. Australia's own Onno Benschop, Phi K6FLAB, and Foundations of Amateur Radio returns this week to his open-source Bald Yak project, where he will teach us to pay attention to the details. Our own amateur radio historian, Will Rogers, K5WLR, returns with another new edition of A Century of Amateur Radio. This week, Will takes us all aboard the Wayback Machine to the year 1920 when amateurs discovered that radio waves didn't simply move from point to point along a straight line and decrease in strength with distance. Something else was happening too, but what? Will answers this question in an episode entitled The QSS Tests. We will stop by and visit with Bill Salyers, AJ8B in the DX Corner, with all the latest news on DXpeditions, DX, upcoming radio sport contests and more. That's all straight ahead as North America's premier amateur radio and technology news magazine and bulletin service, This Week in Amateur Radio, takes to the air right now. Reporting from our headquarters studio in upstate New York, where once again we find ourselves with snow, rain, and ice falling from the skies, this is W2XBS.
And reporting from our news bureau in Salem, Ohio, this is Denny Haight, NZ8D.
And reporting from our news bureau just outside Albany, New York, in the Geek Cave studios, I'm Rich Lawrence, KB2MOB.
And reporting this week from our news bureau in downtown Syracuse, New York, in Armory Square, I'm Chris Perrine, KB2FAF.
And from our news bureau in Naugatuck, Connecticut, where we've had just about enough winter, I'm Steve Sawyer, K1FRC.
And reporting from our news bureau in Middle Tennessee, where I'm sitting all alone on Valentine's Day, I'm Al Shepard, WK8W.
And reporting from our Troy, New York News Bureau, where we're still waiting for that snow that didn't come, I'm Eric, KD2RJX.
And reporting from our amateur radio outpost in the western Catskill Mountains of upstate New York, we're expecting some snow and some freezing rain and then some regular rain, and early bird farmers are already tapping the maple trees. I'm Don Hulick, K2ATJ.
And reporting from our news bureau in Fayetteville, Arkansas, where more snow is promised to be on the way, I'm Will Rogers, K5WLR, thinking the North Pole's recent move must have been just down the street from right here.
And now, with our lead story, here is Denny Haight, NZ8D.
In a developing story, on February 12, 2025, Rig Expert's administrative office in Kyiv, Ukraine, was destroyed by a Russian ballistic missile. All employees are reported to be safe. Rig Expert is a leading manufacturer of antenna and cable analyzers, and officials said they are committed to restoring operations as soon as possible. Our top priority is the safety of our team and the continuity of our operations, said Ashot Andreev, Chief Executive Officer. While our administrative office is in ruins, our production facility survived, allowing us to continue serving our customers and partners. The company issued a statement saying even though this is a difficult situation, the Rig Expert team is committed to restoring operations as soon as possible to continue providing our great products to you. We are working tirelessly to minimize delays and fulfill our commitments while maintaining customer support operations.
Screen Rant magazine reports of an upcoming film set to portray the late Art Bell and his radio show Coast to Coast AM. Paul Giamatti is said to be starring in the lead role. With Giamatti, a two-time Oscar-nominated actor, attached to star, the Art Bell biopic has received a big boost in terms of its prestige. The late paranormal DJ hosted the 5-hour radio show Coast to Coast, which took unscreened calls from guests recounting allegedly first-hand tales of alien encounters, reincarnation, time travel, and other phenomena reminiscent of the X-Files. Bell even claimed to have had his own UFO encounter. At the peak of its popularity during the 90s, Coast to Coast drew an audience of roughly 10 million listeners nightly. Amazon and Warner Brothers are said to be bidding on the project. In addition to working as a radio host, Art Bell was an amateur radio operator holding a license in the U.S., W6OBB, since reassigned, and Philippines call for F1AB. He was originally licensed at age 13, eventually earning an extra class license in the United States.
In enforcement news, the U.S. Federal Communications Commission has upheld the record fine it proposed in 2022 for an Idaho-based amateur radio operator for intentionally interfering with radio communications during fire suppression efforts. In a forfeiture order released in early January, the commission affirmed its original civil penalty of $34,000 against Jason Frawley, a licensee of amateur radio station WA7 QC, for willfully and repeatedly operating without authorization and interfering with the radio communications of the United States Forest Service back in 2021. Specifically, Frawley was found responsible for interfering with the radio communications of the U.S. Forest Service and the Idaho Department of Lands during efforts to direct fire suppression on a 1,000-acre wildfire on national forest lands. The FCC originally issued a notice of apparent liability for forfeiture back in June of 2022, proposing a fine of $34,000, the maximum allowable fine in such cases. Frawley responded to the NAL, acknowledging that he did transmit on government frequencies, but claimed that his good faith and non-malicious intent to help the emergency responders, along with a history of compliance with applicable regulations, should warrant a reduction in the proposed fine. In the end, the FCC denied Frawley's request for leniency, upholding its originally proposed fine.
You are listening to This Week in Amateur Radio, available to download as a podcast from anywhere on the web podcasts are available.
Timothy Ellum, KC, VE6SH, who is the president of the International Amateur Radio Union, reminds all of us that this is the year that the International Amateur Radio Union celebrates a century of connections. When amateur radio pioneers first gathered in Paris on April 18, 1925, they created the International Amateur Radio Union to support their activities worldwide. Since then, the IARU has worked tirelessly to defend and expand the official frequency allocations for amateur radio. Thanks to the support of enlightened administrations in every part of the globe, radio amateurs can experiment and communicate in frequency bands that are strategically located throughout the radio spectrum. From 25 countries in 1925, the IARU has grown to include over 160 member societies today. In the meantime, the IARU is kicking off its centenary celebrations on April 18th, World Amateur Radio Day. Our theme for this year is A Century of Connections, celebrating 100 years of amateur radio innovation, community, and advocacy. As an advocate and representative for the amateur services, the IARU is a proud and active member of the International Telecommunications Union, or ITU. They were first admitted into the work of the Consultative Committee on International Radio, that was the forerunner to today's ITU radio communications sector, back in 1932. IARU have continued contributing to ITU's radio communications and emergency response activities ever since.
The U.S. Senate is getting ready to vote on a proposed law that would retain consumers' access to AM radio in all new vehicles sold around the country. The AM Radio for Every Vehicle Act, which is being challenged by a number of automakers, has support from a number of major lawmakers in both parties. The bill has a version that is also being considered in the House of Representatives. The act was introduced last year, but lawmakers failed to move forward on it in time before the end of the last congressional session in December. The bill's advocates have said that they acknowledge the important role that AM radio plays in the nation's emergency alert system and in transmitting life-saving information during disasters. Proponents include the National Association of Broadcasters and the new FCC chairman, Brendan Carr. An article on the Radio World website noted that this measure is one of the few to have both political parties behind it, both among lawmakers and at the FCC. The road has not been a smooth one, however. The Radio Inc. website reported that car makers have made a formidable investment worth $26.73 million in lobbying against the bill's passage. Disclosures in lobbying documents showed that Detroit-based General Motors was among the top 10 corporate spenders in the fourth quarter of 2024, allocating $4 million to their efforts to win lawmakers over. Other big spenders included Toyota, Honda, and Ford. Manufacturers of electric vehicles, such as Tesla and Rivian, have been in the vanguard of opposition, claiming that the high-voltage electrical systems in their vehicles are not compatible with AM radio and cause distortion and interference. Those car makers spent $190,000 and $40,000 respectively.
The 320-ton rotating curtain antenna in Moosbrunn, Austria, was dismantled this week as part of the decommissioning of the historic shortwave radio site ORS, according to reporting from the Austrian newspaper Der Standard. A true monster of a shortwave antenna has been standing near Moosbrunn, south of Vienna, since 1983. The curtain antenna weighs 320 tons, produces up to 500 kilowatts, and has two towers, each 76 meters high. The system runs on rails so that it can be rotated 180 degrees. This is unique, at least in Europe, and makes it possible to broadcast to the furthest corners of the Earth. Nevertheless, owner ORS, a majority subsidiary of ORF, the Austrian Broadcasting Corporation, would like to demolish the facility. The Moosbrunn site, overall, had been used since 1959, according to reporting from the German media outlet Haight Online. The process began last fall, and the unique antenna was successfully dismantled using a precise, targeted explosion, according to a press release from the ORS. Haight Online quoted Michael Kestelek, OE1MCU, president of the Austrian Experimental Radio Association, as saying that the decision by ORF was extremely regrettable, and pointed out that the service the shortwave signal still provided in places like Russia, where listening to foreign broadcasts is otherwise very difficult. The rapid death of the industrial monument comes as a big surprise. Amateur radio operators are dismayed. Now, many relying on the internet makes them completely dependent on other service providers and political influencers, and online transmissions can be manipulated or blocked in target areas. In Russia, you can no longer listen to many stations via the internet, but you can via shortwave. The discussion about net neutrality also has an influence here. A petition to save the historic site received approximately 3,000 online signatures. According to Haight Online, Radio Österreich international programs were broadcast from the site until it was shut down in 2003. The shortwave transmitter was still used as a relay transmitter for international broadcasters through 2024.
A $10,000 grant to the University of Scranton from the Frankfurt Radio Club in Pennsylvania will support the development of a contest dashboard that will leverage the popularity of amateur radio operator contests to benefit science, technology, students, and ham radio science citizen investigation, or ham-SCI community members. John Ross, KD8IDJ, has all the details.
Through the grant, a team of university students, faculty, and FRC members, along with AMSAT community members, will collaborate to develop a real-time contesting DX dashboard for the AMSAT Personal Space Weather Station, known as PSWS. The PSWS is a modular ground-based system that measures space weather impacts on the Earth's ionosphere. The grant will fund University of Scranton student researcher Owen Zadetsky, KD3ALD of Shohola Township in Pennsylvania, a first-year computer engineering major for the summer and fall 2025 semesters, to help develop the contest dashboard, and it is expected to be concluded in the spring semester of 2026. University of Scranton physics professor Nathaniel Frizzell, W2NAF, said that through the project, he hopes the university's W3USR amateur radio club members, present and future, will become active radio contesters. We are already ahead of schedule for this project, said Dr. Frizzell. This past weekend, we hosted students from W3USR and the Frankfurt Radio Club to take part in a little contesting. We made over 400 QSOs worth over 250,000 contest points. I'm John Ross, KD8IDJ.
We're already ahead of schedule for this project, said Dr. Frizzell. This past weekend, we hosted students from W3USR and the Frankfurt Radio Club to take part in a little contesting. We made over 400 QSOs with over 250,000 context posts. Ray Scohola, K9RS, past president of the Frankfurt Radio Club, said that the amateur radio contesters are some of the most enthusiastic subset of ham radio operators, and participants scan the range of ages from teenagers to well over 90.
The magnetic North Pole has officially shifted position, continuing its movement away from Canada and towards Siberia. The event has prompted a recalibration of navigation systems used in ships, airplanes, and other technologies. This point on Earth, where the magnetic field points vertically downwards, is constantly changing due to the dynamic movement of iron and nickel within our planet's core. Experts around the world collaborate every 5 years to update the World Magnetic Model, a crucial tool that maps the shifting magnetic landscape. Historically, the magnetic North Pole has drifted slowly around Canada since the 1500s. But recent decades have seen an unprecedented acceleration towards Siberia, followed by a sudden deceleration in the past 5 years. This unusual behavior is attributed to the influence of two large magnetic lobes beneath Canada and Siberia. The latest World Magnetic Model, released in 2025, provides a more precise map of magnetic north, including a higher resolution version with 10 times greater detail than previous models. This improved accuracy is vital for navigation. For instance, a journey from South Africa to the UK using the old World Magnetic Model could result in a 150-kilometer deviation. While mapping and logistics companies, governments, and agencies will actively incorporate these updates, Consumers won't need to manually adjust their phones or satellite navigation, as the changes will be implemented automatically. Since its discovery in 1831, tracking the magnetic North Pole has become increasingly important for understanding our planet's dynamic magnetic field.
Coming up on our 26th year keeping the amateur radio community around the world informed, you are listening to This Week in Amateur Radio. Available worldwide as a podcast from our web at twiar.net.
Amateur radio operators have picked up suspicious late-night radio signals in coded Bengali, Urdu, and Arabic along the Indo-Bangladesh border in South Bengal over the past 2 months, raising concerns about possible extremist activities, officials said. The development comes amidst ongoing unrest in Bangladesh and growing anti-India rhetoric in the neighboring country. Alarmed by these transmissions, the operators involved the Ministry of Communications. The matter was subsequently forwarded to the International Monitoring Station in Calcutta for tracking. Ham radio operators have also been asked to monitor and report if similar signals are detected again. These suspicious radio signals have been picked up between 1 a.m. and 3 a.m. The transmissions are in coded Bengali with a Bangladeshi accent, Urdu, and Arabic. Sometimes there are signals in another language that we couldn't identify. Whenever we asked those communicating to identify themselves, they went silent, and Barish Nag Biswas, secretary of the West Bengal Radio Club, said. According to Biswas, the first such signal was detected by a ham radio operator in Sadepur in North 24 Parganas district in mid-December. Initially, we did not attach much importance to it, but then similar signals were detected from Basirhat, Bongaon, and later from South 24 Parganas district. Even during the Gangasanar Mela in mid-January, several ham radio users reported hearing these suspicious signals, he said. Asked why these signals seemed suspicious, Biswas explained that their pattern and language usage were unusual. The global norm among ham radio users is that if a third party enters an ongoing communication, they must identify themselves using a radio identification code or radio call sign. But in these cases, whenever we asked for identification, the signals went silent. The pattern remained the same in all instances, he said. A senior official from a security agency who visited Biswas's place for details declined to comment on the matter. When contacted, a senior BSF official acknowledged the seriousness of the situation, stating that unidentified radio chatter along the border is a matter of concern. If we receive details from ham radio users, we will use our resources to track the source of these transmissions, the BSF official said. He added that it is not uncommon for smugglers and extremist groups to use ham radio frequencies, as this mode of communication is unconventional and harder to track compared to mobile networks or emails, which are more easily monitored. Biswas recalled previous instances where suspicious and unidentified radio transmissions were detected.
WJLX-AM in Jasper, Alabama, which made national headlines last year after the sudden disappearance of its broadcast facilities, resumed operations on 12:40 a.m. Jonathan Timmons has taken over operations of the station as acting general manager. He set about a whirlwind 22-day effort to restore the AM signal before the one-year deadline of its silent special temporary authority. The station filed for an STA after Brett Elmore, its general manager, reported to police that the station's 200-foot AM tower and transmitter had been stolen. Elmore died in October at the age of 41. Timmons had known Elmore since their time at Curry High School in Jasper. He later joined the Marine Corps, but remained in touch with Elmore. We'd talk nearly every day, Timmons recalled. Elmore invited Timmons to cover local sports broadcasts in 2015, which sparked his interest in broadcasting. Now Timmons has assumed control of the station Elmore had established in Walker County. I just couldn't sit back and see his reputation take a hit, Timmons said of Elmore. He loved the community, and everything he did was in an effort to serve it. Timmons has been frustrated by people criticizing Elmore on social media, especially since Elmore is no longer able to defend himself. He doesn't know what happened to the missing tower or transmitter. He said the transmitter site showed evidence of vandalism and was in a general state of disrepair. I just wish he had come to me sooner, Timmons said, regarding Elmore and the site's problems. Over 22 days, Timmons and his team cleared the site and set up 2 power poles in the swamp where WJLX's transmitter is located. Timmons traveled to Donaldsville, Georgia, to pick up a Harris Gates 1,000-watt transmitter. He then took it to Michael Patton and Associates in Baton Rouge to have it tuned to 12:40 a.m. On Thursday, January 30th, Timmons picked up the transmitter in Louisiana and installed the 500-pound unit at the site the next day. Using a long wire antenna, he and a fellow colleague connected it to the transmitter. Patton assisted in setting up an antenna tuning unit, and by 6 p.m. on February 1st, WJLX was back on the air. Timmons said the station is operating at approximately 100 watts under a temporary setup. WJLX owns a 195-foot tower that he plans to erect as part of a more permanent AM setup. He also credited Dave Snavely, the former owner of WIXI-AM in Jasper, for his guidance and assistance. Timmons owns an industrial maintenance business in the region. My day-to-day is usually problem-solving, he explained, but that's a lot of what broadcasting is, too. After Elmore's death, Timmons was in touch with his family, including Elmore's mother, and discussed plans for the station going forward. As a result, since November, he's assumed operation of the station after purchasing a share from its owner, James Early. Early, 83, is more of a silent partner, according to Timmons. He said that every dime of advertising dollars since then has been used to acquire the transmitter and have it programmed. Only $14,000 of the approximately $23,000, Timmons said, has been released from the GoFundMe set up by Elmore to help rebuild the station. Timmons says his investment of time is, in part, a way to give back to the generosity Elmore showed him over the years, including his support for Timmons' nephew after a swimming pool accident. The station's saga caused speculation of just how an antenna tower could disappear. In trade news reporting, Elmore said he had been working with the Jasper Police Department in investigating the disappearance. Elmore had wanted to keep the station's 101.5 FM translator on the air after the disappearance, but the commission denied its request. The FM signal ultimately returned to the air as iHeartMedia WBXB HD3 translator, which Timmons says has continued. Timmons is also taking over operations of 90.1 WERH-FM in Hamilton, which Elmore began broadcasting in July. Now Timmons expects to be in broadcasting for the long haul. It's my way of continuing to serve the community, schools, and athletics that WJLX has offered, Timmons said.
Amateur radio operators are known for their desire and unique ability to provide public service through communication. With more details on training the next generation of net controls, we go to John Ross, KD8I DJ, at League headquarters.
Whether activated for a severe weather event or a local event such as a marathon or bike ride, the utility value and versatility of the amateur radio service is enjoyed by communities around the country. One critical aspect of coordinating the communications is the role of net controller. These key volunteers bring order to chaos and flow to information. It is a specialized skill that requires development, practice, and training. On February 1st, Connecticut volunteers in the Amateur Radio Emergency Service, ARES, held a training session. That session drew dozens of radio amateurs from around the state to a packed room inside the Newington Volunteer Fire Department. The half-day course, led by ARRL Connecticut Section Manager Douglas Harafanowicz, WA1SFH, was dynamic and participatory. George Papp, K1YBO, is a controller for the Western Connecticut Westcon Traffic Net, a part of the ARRL National Traffic System, NTS. It serves to flow messages in, out of, and throughout the state, and to serve as a training net. He was excited to see the high number of attendees. We always encourage new people to step up to volunteer for the net, and this helps provide a pathway for them, he said. In the training, Shahira Fanowich highlighted examples of needing a robust group of trained net control station NCS operators. When a black sky event takes place, it is rarely limited to an 8-hour shift. We will need trained NCS operators not only to provide for initial shift coverage, but also we will need relief NCS operators to cover following shifts, he said. I'm John Ross, KD8I DJ.
If you'd like to get involved as a net control station, talk with your local ARRL emergency coordinator or district emergency coordinator to express your interest. You may also find National Traffic Systems Net resources in your area at nts2.arrl.org.
Amateur radio and politics may not always mix, but almost everyone knows a few names of public officials who have led their nations. In Germany, one amateur radio operator has set his hopes high, too. Although there are numerous amateur radio awards, such as DXCC and Worked All Europe, Friedrich Merz, DK7, DQ, is hoping for an achievement that could be thought of as Worked All Germany, even though, in this case, it's outside the realm of amateur radio. Friedrich Merz is leader of Germany's CDU party and possible front-runner in this month's election to replace Olaf Scholz. A win would make the political conservative the nation's new chancellor, and as such, he would join the ranks of other license heads around the world, most notably the late King Hussein of Jordan, who held the call sign JY1, and the present King of Thailand, whose call sign is HS10A.
You're listening to North America's premier amateur radio and technology news magazine of the air. We are This Week in Amateur Radio, distributed worldwide at twiar.net.
Hello and welcome to the DX Corner for your weekly dose of DX. I'm Bill, AJ8B. Now that my vertical is fixed, I've been hitting 30 meters hard every night. Coming into this past week, I had a CQ marathon score of 26 on 30 meters, and after 4 straight nights, I'm sitting at 71. 30 meters has always been a fun band. I remember when we were first granted access to that band. Chad Harris, VP2ML, editor of the DX magazine, had a contest. The first 100 hams to work 100 entities on 30 received a certificate. I was fortunate enough to receive number 73. That is still in a special place in my shack, and I will always treasure that. This section of DX News comes from Bernie, W3UR, editor of the Daily DX, the Weekly DX, and the How's DX column in QST. If you would like a free 2-week trial of the Daily DX, your only source of real-time DX information, just drop me a note at thedxmentor@gmail.com. And now someone did ask me, what do I mean by real-time DX information? And I'd like to pass this real-world example on. When those couple of guys were able to activate Mount Athos for just a few hours, Bernie was the only person to send an email out to all his subscribers saying, hey, these guys are on the air, get them now. And that was within 30 minutes of them actually coming up on the bands. So that's what I mean by real-time DX information. You can't get it anywhere else. Quote, we made it back. I'm beyond thrilled to share that our entire team has returned safely from Sacrifice Rock to the mainland. Despite the challenges we faced, everyone's doing great and all medical concerns seems to have been addressed. Highlights of the operation. We're still grinning from ear to ear about our operating achievements. 6,668 contacts in just 48 hours with 2 stations, primarily working CW and sideband, but we did do some digital modes when SSB conditions were tough. We managed to complete DXCC and made over 12% of our contacts with North America. Our log will be available starting tomorrow, and our amazing QSL manager will get those cards processed ASAP. What's next? We're excited to introduce DX India, our new group dedicated to activating all India IOTAs, including VU4/VU7. We want to give chasers a chance to work rare entities while having a blast operating with us. What's our next adventure? Mark your calendars for March. We're planning to activate another IOTA during the CQ Worldwide WPX sideband contest, focusing on sideband operations, so stay tuned. We're deeply grateful to our sponsors, donors, and supporters. Your encouragement and feedback mean everything to us. Please keep it coming. And you can contact that group via Sarah, S-A-R-A, at vu2rs.com. So I have an update on the Peter I Island DXpedition. The Peter I DXpedition team has signed a contract with the Iceland-based Ice Tugs to take them to Peter I Island in February 2027, where they intend to stay for 3 weeks. According to the team, quote, Ice Tugs has an excellent track record in providing services for expeditions, cargo, and fuel supplies, tugging as well as rescue and camp setup in the Arctic and Antarctic regions. Ice Tugs is the same company that will take Team Bouvet to their destination in 2026. The team will continue working on securing a helicopter contract that will accommodate 2 helicopters to make this a safe and reliable operation as required by the Norwegian Polar Institute. They are also scheduled to sign a contract with a leading Antarctic expedition company, the Spirit of Sydney, by this summer. This company has successfully organized 80-plus expeditions to the Antarctic and will be leading the Peter I expedition from permit, safety, emergency, and evacuation point of view. The Spirit of Sydney has organized several other expeditions in the Arctic region in collaboration with Ice Tugs. Quote, our team wishes to use this opportunity to thank all the clubs, associations, foundations, as well as individuals who have already provided us with their support. Going to such remote places would not be possible without such generous contributions. Please consider a donation to help us offset some of our costs for the Peter I Island DXpedition by visiting our website. And that website is 3y0lima or 3y0l.com. And I would encourage you, if you can, help them out. Even $10 will make a huge difference. DK1 Charlie Echo, Umar, received his visa for Mali and his flights are now confirmed. He should be QRV from Mali at this time, using the TZ4 AM station. He will be using an Elecraft K3S and a KPA 1500 amplifier, as well as an ICOM IC7300 with wire and Yagi antennas on 160 through 6. On 5 meters, he will use sideband and FT8. Ulmer plans to pay special attention to 160-meter FT8, 80-meter FT8, and to 6 meters. He expects to be there until March 4th. QSOs will be uploaded to Club Log and after the DXpedition to LOTW. You can also QSL via the Bureau or direct to DK1CE. The V-73WW team has safely arrived on the island with all their equipment. They have scouted the area and set up antennas. Their activity started yesterday just before 2200 Zulu. They've been reported on 10, 12, 15, and 40-meter CW and 10-meter sideband. The live log on Club Log will be available soon after internet access is established at the Radio Shack. This operation should last for approximately 12 days, although times on the air may vary based on local conditions. Stay tuned to Facebook and X for the latest updates and frequency information. And also, if you're following me, the DX Mentor, on Facebook, anything I get I will pass along as well. QSL cards will be managed by DJ4MX, and the team will use Club Log OQRS with a direct QSL option available after the DXpedition. Free OQRS Bureau service will be available at a later time. Internet access permitting, they also plan on daily LOTW uploads and Club Log live stream. G7BXU Steve says he's on his way to 9 Lima, Sierra Leone, this month, hoping to be on the air as 9 Lima 1 BXU holiday style in his free time with an IC7300 100 watts to a G5RV type antenna. And you can QSL Steve at G7BXU. Members of the Polish DX team, SP3CFM, SP6EQZ, SP6JIU, and SP9FIH are scheduled to visit 4 Sierra, which is Sri Lanka, at the end of this month. They will operate under the call sign 4S7SPG until March 1st. Their activities will include CW, sideband, FT8, and RIDI on bands ranging from 80 to 10 meters. Your QSL card can be sent via SP6 CIK. And finally, the Rebel DX group will soon be active as 5 November 9 Delta Tango Golf, focusing on FT8. They will use the latest Super Fox and MSHV versions on 20, 17, 15, 12, and 10 meters to maximize QSOs, which benefits smaller stations. You may see 5 November 9 DTG on frequencies like 14074 and 14090 simultaneously. Super Fox will be used until activity drops, then they will switch to MSHV. On 30, 40, 60, 80, and 160, FT8 activity will all be on MSHV. Any 6-meter activity that they can fit in will also use MSHV. Although for this DXpedition, CW and sideband are less important, there will still be some activity in those modes, so stay tuned for that. So here's our context update. I know that the ARL contest sheet is read elsewhere in this podcast, and the contests that I mention are sometimes redundant. However, there are a few contests that I have found to be especially useful for DXers who are trying to fill band slots or to get entities or zones in the log that may be otherwise difficult to get. The weekend of February 21st will feature the CQ 160 meter single sideband contest. Your exchange should be Signal Report and the state or province for Canadian US stations, and Signal Report and CQ Zone for DX stations. This is a really fun contest, and I hope you give it a try. Several weeks ago, I offered you some details on my compact vertical antenna for 160 meters that only needs a 60-foot circle for all of the radials. You can get on 160 very quickly. Just drop me a note at thedxmentor@gmail.com to get the details. That same weekend, we'll host the North American RIDI QSO party. This is also a fun time that allows you to work states and counties that you may need. So if you don't have the ability to work 160, give the North American RIDI QSO party a try. It's a lot of fun. And please send me an email if you need details on any of the things we've talked about. Until next week, this is Bill, AJ8B, saying 7-3, and thanks to my ex-whale Karen for her love and support. I hope to hear you in the pile-ups.
You are listening to This Week in Amateur Radio, available as an on-demand stream from Spotify, Deezer, and wherever podcasts are available.
Welcome aboard the 26th segment of Ham Radio History, a century of amateur radio, hams, organizations, events, inventions. I'm Will Rogers, K5WLR. Thanks to Chris Cadella, W2PA, for giving us permission to use his website in the preparation of these segments. Now, sit back and relax with the next chapter of Ham Radio History. QSS tests. Never having observed the effects of a complete solar cycle on signals before, or at least not having paid attention to them, hams continued to be impressed, intrigued, and puzzled by the changing on-air conditions as the minimum approached, still 2 years away as the new decade began. At least one thing was clear: radio waves didn't simply move from point to point along a straight line and decrease in strength with distance. Something else was happening too. But what? In July 1920, QST noted that the usual summer radio season, meaning markedly worsening conditions, had entirely failed to appear. One reason had to do with an increased activity level and better equipment, but there was also an unusual lack of static on many nights. Equally strange was an increase in signal strength for some stations that had been heard only weekly the previous winter using the same equipment. 1TS observed that different segments of broad signals would fade differently. By constantly shifting his tune, he was able to continue copying a signal that was affected by fading. 8NZ thought he noticed that sharply tuned stations faded less than broad ones, and attributed this to characteristics of the transmitter rather than propagation conditions. The editor concluded that both effects were due to shifting energy from one frequency to another, also blaming the transmitter. Yet he noted that NSF, with an extremely sharp signal, was not free from fading either. It was all quite confusing. A.L. Groves of Brook, Virginia, observed that hams located in the same town using similar receivers, operator ability, and antenna direction would hear entirely different groups of stations coming in loudly. One amateur might hear stations 500 miles away the strongest, another more like 100 to 150 miles, and for still another, the locals were strongest, and it seemed to depend on the height of the receiving antenna. He was on the right track, but did not yet understand that the groupings of received signals likely corresponded to different radiation angles. Gross performed an experiment. With his antenna at 65 feet above ground, he heard the Midwest best, including Chicago, Indiana, and Ohio, but could hardly hear Washington, Baltimore, and Norfolk at all. Lowering his antenna to 30 feet, he could barely hear any 8th and 9th District stations, but could now hear Baltimore stations by the dozens. He speculated that signal strength might be a function of height of both receiving and transmitting stations' antennas. The one exception was 8ER in St. Mary's, Ohio, whom he could not seem to hear very well on any combination, which seems odd given the fact that Mrs. Candler's signal was one of the most prominent and easily copyable ones on the air. He finally offered this insight, viewing QSS as an enhancement, albeit an unusable, unreliable one, rather than fading. One cause of so much so-called freakishness is the fact that the amateur, as a rule, tries to work far in excess of the normal range of his set and calls it freakishness when he can't get through one night or 1 hour as well as he can the next, when in reality it was only freakishness that allowed him to get through at all. In relay work, therefore, Groves asserted that the emphasis should not be on maximum distance, but on establishing reliable links. Warner then wrote of an antenna scheme suggested in another letter from Groves, where horizontal wires at different heights were used, and mentioned a theory that variation in conductivity of the atmosphere converts the radio waves to a higher or lower altitude. They were getting close, but still did not quite appreciate things like radiation angle and sky waves. Instead of going on indefinitely as was originally thought, the QSS tests would conclude on August 31 so that analysis could proceed and perhaps improve the experimental methods. The basic procedure remained unchanged. Transmitting stations repeatedly sent a complete alphabet and receiving stations recorded the strength for each letter on a scale from 0 to 9. But intelligently choosing which stations to monitor and when was just becoming clear. By late summer, the test organizers were already recommending new monitoring procedures based on what had been learned thus far in an effort to make the reports more meaningful. For example, more could be learned by repeatedly monitoring the same transmitting station at the same time each night than by switching around to listen to different ones. The Bureau tests would be tabulated and reported by the ARRL. Already the results seem to support an increasingly popular scientific theory that reflection or refraction of waves was the cause of fading. The evidence for this was progressive fading, that which varied successively along a line outward from the transmitter, which could only be explained by a reflection mechanism occurring high in the atmosphere. The example test station cited for this was 2JU, whose transmission showed in one case a fading characteristic that became later in time at each of several receiving stations, progressively spaced further away. Continued analysis might make it possible to calculate the position of the reflecting media, whatever it was, learn about it, and maybe do something about it, still hoping. They also believe that changes in received wavelength, as reported by some, were merely reception artifacts. It was possible, however, for a broad transmission to simultaneously fade on one wavelength and not on another. The first part of the long-awaited report led the November issue of QST. The entire report had already been presented to the RCA on 24 September at Columbia University. Written by frequent QST technical author Robert S. Cruz, who had held the title of Assistant Electrical Engineer at the Bureau of Standards, the article described how the tests were run. They had been a collaborative government amateur operation, exemplified by Cruz, a member of both groups. The ARRL selected the stations and conducted the operation, and the Bureau analyzed the reports and provided overall guidance. Hams were particularly interested in the prevalence of fading effects in shortwave work, so much so that QSS had now become as often used on the air as QRM and QRN in describing adverse conditions affecting relay work. Many thought that if by running tests amateurs could better understand the phenomena, they might be able to avoid it. Few yet considered using and exploiting a newly discovered capability. 6 amateur stations and NSF, the Navy station in Washington, were selected to transmit at specific times each Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday night for 6 weeks during the summer. The group included some of the most well-known amateurs in relay work: 1AW, 8XK, 9ZN, 8ER, and 9LC. All had received special authority to use a 250-meter wavelength. Cruz himself manned WWV, the Bureau of Standards station in Washington, D.C. 51 receiving or recording stations were chosen from the Atlantic coast west to Illinois and Iowa, and from New Hampshire south to Virginia and Tennessee. Among the recorders were many more accomplished relayers, including Vermilia 1ZE. They all use similar antennas and a Paragon receiver consisting of a regenerative detector and a two-stage audio amplifier. While each transmitting station took its turn sending the test sequence, the remaining 6 acted as recorders. Although criticized for their decision, the test organizers confined the operation to the Northeast in order to make the analysis task manageable. The more than 1,000 expected reports would make it tedious and time-consuming, and because a greater number of qualified stations were available there. Tests were conducted at a wavelength of 250 meters under a special government permit, which was not required for 9ZN and 8XK, both of whom already had special licenses, and NSF, a government station. Warner and Maxim at 1AW in Hartford ran their own preparatory experiment to test the repeatability of the recording method. Listening to 2JU transmitting from Long Island, they demonstrated that 2 independent listeners would always produce curves of the same general sequence of ups and downs, although absolute levels and precise shape may vary. Before receivers had S-meters and no other quantitative measurement of received signal strength was in use, the QSS tests relied on ears to detect and brains to judge signal levels. Each test commenced at 10 p.m. Eastern Time, with all transmitting stations listening for the time from Arlington. 1AW would then announce the test by sending a QST beginning at 10:10, and each of the other transmitting stations would follow at 10-minute intervals.
A quick break for identification purposes. You're listening to This Week in Amateur Radio. I'm Will Rogers, K5WLR.
In December, Part 2 of the report presented the initial results from those tests which took place under summer conditions, that is, during the final month. Several notable things had been demonstrated. There were 3 kinds of fading, very rapid, moderately fast, and slow, and it was conclusively a distance phenomena since no receivers observed fading of signals from nearby transmitters. One could often correlate results, checks, from several receiving stations within the same geographical area that were all monitoring the same transmitting station. Sometimes such a correlation of reports could also be observed between receiving stations that were further apart. Occasionally a correlation would be displaced in time, with a curve repeating itself later in the alphabet at one station compared with a second. 16 of these time-sequenced correlations were discovered that involved 3 stations, and 32 that involved only 2 and were discounted. No weather correlation was found at all. Another correlation, inverse curves, was a pair of curves in which one had a shape roughly the mirror image of the other. It was not frequently observed, though, and Kruse speculated they might only be coincidences. Analysts began to speculate about the physical phenomena that might account for their observations. For example, if the theory about reflection or refraction layers was correct, such a layer would have to be very large and could be a large cloud, fog bank, massive fumes from an industrial plant, or perhaps the Heaviside layer, an atmospheric layer predicted by scientists but not yet confirmed by experiment. 3ZF later postulated that ground waves were absorbed while waves at higher angles were reflected by a stratum in the atmosphere, and perhaps there was destructive interference taking place between ground and sky. Almost unanimously, the test recorders believed that fading was not due to signal strength variation at all, but wavelength variation, though not caused by the transmitter itself, since they could usually recover a signal by retuning, misunderstanding that a broad spark signal might undergo selective fading. Participants were therefore asked specifically not to retune and thereby introduce another variable. Furthermore, Kruse discounted this notion by reporting that modulated CW signals could not be recovered this way and exhibited no trace of the effect. Interrupted continuous wave, ICW, is a CW signal modulated using a chopper to pulse it, thereby making it audible without using a beat oscillator. Even more hams participated in the second series of QSS tests held in October than the first. Over 2,200 records had been reported by the new year, even with spotty participation in some of the districts. In particular, no good data had been received from Cleveland and Philadelphia, primarily due to the QRM problem from unlicensed spark coil stations. It seemed they might actually have outnumbered properly licensed stations in those cities. Warner suggested that the two prominent local clubs should work to clean up the situation, but advised caution, writing, "We suggest the appointment by each club of a strong investigation committee charged with the duty of digging out these offenders. Wufang tactics should not be used at first, as without doubt many of these men do not know that they are violating a federal law, and a spirit of friendly cooperation and assistance in enlightening them and helping them to secure licenses will result in more good stations, more members for the clubs, and the conversion of a dangerous situation into a local organization of which any club may be proud." The final report on the QSS tests named the winners of the Bureau of Standards prizes for receiving. Maxim was declared the overall winner after applying a somewhat complex scoring scheme. Solar phenomena, signal fading or enhancement, and the changes with distance and antenna height, it all added up to something. Probing the limits of understanding how radio waves behaved, hams had just scratched the surface, not quite yet understanding something that would be a bigger prize for them all. Included in this material are quotes from the following: Lost, a 1920 Summer Season, editorial QST, July 1920, page 23. On Freak Reception, Radio Communications by the Amateurs, QST, July 1920, page 50. The ARRL QSS Tests, QST, August 1920, page 5. S. Cruz, The Bureau of Standards, ARRL Tests of Shortwave Radio Signal Fading, Part 1, QST, November 1920, page 5. S. Cruz, The Bureau of Standards, ARRL Tests of Shortwave Radio Signal Fading, Part 2, QST, December 1920, page 13. J.V. Purcell, Theory of Freak Transmission, QST, November 1921, page 24. The Fading Tests, QST, January 1921, page 12. With appreciation to Chris Cadella, W2PA, for allowing us to use his website's materials, Ham Radio History, A Century of Amateur Radio, Ham's Organizations, Events, Inventions, in the preparation of this segment. I'm Will Rogers, K5WLR, reporting for This Week in Amateur Radio.
The 320-ton rotating curtain antenna in Moosbrunn, Austria, was dismantled this week as part of the decommissioning of the historic shortwave radio site ORS, according to reporting from the Austrian newspaper Der Standard. A true monster of a shortwave antenna has been standing near Moosbrunn, south of Vienna, since 1983. The curtain antenna weighs 320 tons, produces up to 500 kilowatts, and has two towers, each 76 meters high. The system runs on rails so that it can be rotated 180 degrees. This is unique, at least in Europe, and makes it possible to broadcast to the furthest corners of the Earth. Nevertheless, owner ORS, a majority subsidiary of ORF, the Austrian Broadcasting Corporation, would like to demolish the facility. The Moosbrunn site overall had been used since 1959, according to reporting from the German media outlet Haight Online. The process began last fall, and the unique antenna was successfully dismantled using a precise, targeted explosion, according to a press release from the ORS. Haight Online quoted Michael Kestelek, OE1MCU, president of the Austrian Experimental Radio Association, as saying that the decision by ORF was extremely regrettable, and pointed out that the service the shortwave signal still provided in places like Russia, where listening to foreign broadcasts is otherwise very difficult. The rapid death of the industrial monument comes as a big surprise. Amateur radio operators are dismayed. Now, many relying on the internet makes them completely dependent on other service providers and political influencers, and online transmissions can be manipulated or blocked in target areas. In Russia, you can no longer listen to many stations via the internet, but you can via shortwave. The discussion about net neutrality also has an influence here. A petition to save the historic site received approximately 3,000 online signatures. According to Haight Online, Radio Osterich international programs were broadcast from the site until it was shut down in 2003. The shortwave transmitter was still used as a relay transmitter for international broadcasters through 2024.
Faced with the upcoming sunset of methods used to calculate fees for repeaters, beacons, and some apparatus amateur licenses, the Australian Communications and Media Authority has finalized small changes it is making. These changes, based on a new methodology, will take effect after the 1st of April sunset of the previous method. The result is that repeaters, beacons, and non-assigned apparatus licenses will be assessed $52.62 annually. The changes do not affect those holding Australian-class licenses, which have no annual fees. The ACMA said in its February 5th announcement that it has not yet finalized its apparatus license tax reforms for radio navigation satellite service repeaters.
You are listening to North America's premier news and information service for the amateur radio hobbyist. We are This Week in Amateur Radio.
Foundations of Amateur Radio. Recently, I built a first attempt at a noise-cancelling circuit on my couch in GNU Radio, without holding a soldering iron and running the risk of the room smelling like burnt chicken, because if you believe the internet, sometimes holding a hot piece of metal by the hot end is not the best way. The idea behind the circuit, or more accurately flow graph, is that you take a signal from two sources, invert one, combine them, and then they cancel each other out. If the signal with the noise only contains noise, then you can, at least theoretically, remove the noise from the actual signal. Before you think that I'm inventing something new, I'm not. I'm merely attempting to recreate the same notion I came across decades ago, where you combine the signal from two microphones, preferably identical, reversing the wiring in one and talking into a microphone whilst holding the other one away from your mouth. I did essentially the same thing using two RF signals from two RTL SDR dongles. Randall, Victor Kilo 6 Whiskey Romeo, pointed out that, aside from misusing the word mix, which in electronics really means multiply, but in audio means combine, Randall suggested I use add and subtract. I'm still working out how best to name things, because we're talking about audio and RF, sometimes at the same time. Perhaps that's where I went wrong. I'm currently using combine as my technology-neutral word, but I'm happy to take suggestions. All that was the sideshow, because as Randall points out, doing this in RF is much harder than in audio. This is already something I knew. At the time, I didn't really know how to get two different but the same sources of audio to experiment with, so I started in the deep end at the RTL SDR dongle side. Now, armed with the encouragement from Randall, I built a horrible thing, which is easy when you just drag and drop blocks on a screen. I built two independent FM decoders that use the exact same parameters, so they're tuned to the same frequency. They're amplified and tweaked identically. The only difference is that they each decode a different dongle. I then piped each of those into my magic noise-cancelling circuit and tried again. Aside from dealing with hardware restrictions causing things like buffer under and overrun, that's when the computer isn't processing all your samples or is getting ahead of itself and is running out of samples, I can make audio come out of the speaker in my computer. I can prove that there are two signals by setting the amplification of either to 0 and still get sound from the other source. However, noise cancelling, no matter what I tried, didn't work. Then I decided to simplify. rather than trying to cancel out "The Heat Is On," word of honor, I'm not making that up, that's the song that was playing, I went back to basics, starting with a tone. I fed the same tone into the noise-cancelling block twice, once as signal, once as noise. Magic, the cancelling works. I also learned that changing the frequency of the noise and changing it back gets you into all kinds of problems, and even if you send the same tone, one shifted in phase by a known amount, getting the two to cancel each other out is non-trivial. You might think that this was all a complete waste of time, and if you're just driving past, it looks like a swollen electrolytic capacitor about to burst your bubble, but it's not that bad. Here's what I learned from this little adventure. I can make hierarchical blocks out of flow graphs. This is important because at some point all the functionality associated with Bald Yak will likely end up being implemented like this. I also learned that such a block can contain user interface elements, which means that we can build blocks that know how to do stuff and tweak how they operate without having to build a user interface every time we use such a block. I learned that we can implement an idea that would be hard using physical components and test it really quickly. In this case, my available time was the limiting factor, not the testing. If I'd done this with components, I'd still be trying to figure out where to get them from, let alone turn up the heat. Another bonus is that I didn't spend a single dime and I can dispose of it with the click of a button, rather than trying to figure out how to recycle components and circuit boards. I also learned that the idea as I built it doesn't work quite as I expected, and that things that I didn't anticipate, like changing the frequency, buffer under and overruns, impacted my efforts in unexpected ways. There's a delay between making a change on the user interface and the effect becoming audible. And I learned that I can make a dongle work on my computer and that installing GNU Radio is a challenge at the best of times. In other words, even though I'm unlikely to use the noise-cancelling efforts in their current form, there was plenty I learned from the experience. From my perspective, this was a success. What have you experimented with and learned? On a completely unrelated matter, long overdue and music to the ears of some, can you spell SKCC, I finally put all the Morse code versions of my podcast on a thumb drive and plugged it into my car. During the week, I've managed to listen to about 2 hours of Morse. While I don't know most of the letters of the alphabet, I can still detect letter and word boundaries. I'm Ono, Victor Kilo 6, Foxtrot Lima, Alpha Bravo.
On January 21st, 2025, dozens of stations across Northeast Illinois gathered for a 70-centimeter simplex research event. With all the details on this research event, we go to John Ross, KD8 IDJ at League Headquarters.
The goal was to encourage simplex use, to expand operator skills, and to allow operators to better understand their station's capability and limitations. The operation involved 2 rounds of transmissions and collectively logged over 400 signal reports received by email and aggregated by their net control station. Operators freed themselves from repeaters and access tones and learned to relay, record RST, readability, signal strength tone, signal reports, and pay attention to their noise floor and antenna configurations. One relay through 4 stations spanned nearly 60 miles, allowing net control W9MSG in Glen Ellen, Illinois, to receive a message from KE9 PBO in Sandwich, Illinois, operating on a handheld with 5 watts of power. After the event, all logs were collected and aggregated, and each station received a report that included details of all signal reports given for their station by all other operators. The report also included maps, statistics, and examples of how to leverage the data to better understand station configuration. This included a subsequent discussion on how to create radio path studies leveraging free online resources. I'm John Ross, KD8IDJ.
This was the second of 2 such events. The first was a 2-meter simplex activity in the same area the prior month with 35 stations across 7 countries. Data from both of these nets is now being aggregated to identify qualitative and quantitative differences between 2 meters and 70 centimeters as experienced by those operators. All of this will lead to a discussion of the propagation challenges and advantages that each band offers and more opportunities for learning.
World Amateur Radio Day is held on April 18th every year, and in 2025, World Amateur Radio Day is extra special. ARRL invites radio clubs and schools to organize a ham radio open house in April to highlight the amateur radio service for its development and practice of the latest radio communications and technology, and as a hands-on pathway into STEM fields for the next generation. ARRL Public Relations and Outreach Manager Sierra Harrop, W5DX, and Associate Professor of Physics and Engineering at the University of Scranton, Nathaniel Frizzell, W2NAF, join the podcast to talk about what a ham radio open house might include and how your club or group can start organizing one.
The oldest of the Starlink satellites is coming back to Earth, and NASA has detected metallic vapors in the atmosphere as they disintegrate. The vapors containing aluminum and other metals as they re-enter the atmosphere and burn up. These are the so-called Generation 1 satellites that were launched starting in 2018. According to Jonathan McDowell, an astronomer at Harvard University's Center for Astrophysics, 4 or 5 of these satellites is incinerated every day. He told the Space Weather website that the sustained rate of daily re-entries is unprecedented. He said that the fireballs are not a surprise to the constellation's partners, who are removing the oldest satellites and replacing them with the next generation. All that debris is adding up and apparently having other effects. The Space Weather website said that just one of these satellites can produce about 30 kilograms or 66 pounds of aluminum oxide.
You are listening to This Week in Amateur Radio, available to download as a podcast from anywhere on the web podcasts are available.
Bruce Page, KK5DO, is here now with this week's AMSAT report. Bruce?
Thanks, John. January 23rd, AMSAT Spain's Haight R was deployed and is operating as expected. This gives us another FM satellite. The downlink is 436.888 MHz, and the uplink is 145.925 MHz. No tone is required, activating by squelch. The satellite also uses AX.25 and APRS digital modes. FM voice is the primary mission. You may not hear the digital modes all the time. In March, they plan on launching Haight's ICM. We look forward to another successful launch and another satellite in the space family. If you're a grid square chaser, I noticed the VUCC rankings for satellite this week. After the success of GreenCube IO117 and S-Hale QO100, many were able to build on the VUCC and DXCC collection. Doug, K8DP, just upped his grid square count to 1,737, while Guntram OE9 DGV upped his DXCC count to 213. This is Bruce Page, KK5DO. Back to you, John.
And thanks, Bruce, for that report.
It is time for this week's propagation and solar weather report. NOAA reports a G1 minor geomagnetic stormwatch was issued for February 14, 2025. A coronal hole high-speed stream is expected to move into a position favorable for enhanced interaction between the high-speed stream and Earth's magnetosphere. These enhancements are likely to cause elevated geomagnetic responses, with G1 minor storm levels likely. The greatest observed 3-hour KP over the past 24 hours was 4. The greatest expected 3-hour KP for February 15 is 4.67. No minor S1 or greater solar radiation storms are expected. No significant active region has activity favorable for radiation storm production is forecast. Radio blackouts reaching the R1 levels were observed over the past few days. The largest was on February 13 at 11:09 UTC. Solar activity is expected to be low with a chance for R1 to R2, and minor to moderate activity on February 15. The 10.7 centimeter flux remains at 185 for February 15 through the 17th. Solar cycle 25 is intensifying, and this is reflected in the number of cosmic rays entering Earth's atmosphere. Neutron counts from the University of Oulu's Sodankala Geophysical Observatory in Finland show that cosmic rays reaching Earth are slowly declining, a result of the yin-yang relationship between the solar cycle and cosmic rays. Solar activity has been at low levels for the past 24 hours and is expected to be low with a chance for M-class flares on February 13th through the 15th. The geomagnetic field has been at unsettled to active levels for the past few days. For more information concerning radio propagation, visit the ARRL Technical Information Service and read the article entitled What the Numbers Mean, and check out the propagation page of Karl Lewetzelschwab, K9LA.
In Radio Sport this week, more great contest opportunities. February 14th, it's the Pedexus 070 Club Valentine Sprint. That's digital. February 15th and 16th, the ARRL International DX Contest, CW. Also on February 15th and 16th, the YLRL YLOM Contest, CW Phone and Digital. February 15th to the 16th, the Russian PSK WW Contest, that's digital. February 15th as well, the Feldhell Sprint, digital. February 16th through the 17th, it's the Run for the Bacon QRP Contest, that's CW. And on February 19th, the AGCW Semi-Automatic Key Evening, that is CW as well. And remember to visit the ARRL contest calendar for more events and information. Upcoming section, state, and division conventions on February 14th through the 15th, the Yuma Hamfest hosting the ARRL Southwestern Division Convention in Yuma, Arizona. February 22nd, HamCon hosting the ARRL Vermont State Convention. That's in Colchester, Vermont. February 28th through March 1st, the Birmingham Fest hosting the ARRL Alabama Section Convention in Tressville, Alabama. And on March 7th through the 8th, the Greater Houston Hamfest hosting the ARRL Texas State Convention. That's in Rosenberg, Texas.
The Hurricane Watch Net, or HWN, founded on Labor Day weekend of 1965, is celebrating its 60th anniversary. With more details, not only on the HWN anniversary, but with news on their net control recruitment program, we go to John Ross, KD8IDJ, with this special report.
The Hurricane WatchNet, HWN, founded on Labor Day weekend 1965, is celebrating its 60th anniversary this year. Net manager Bobby Graves, KB5HAV, reports that HWN is preparing for what could be yet again an above-average hurricane season, and that the net needs more amateur radio operators to help. We are starting early in this year's preparations and looking to add more net control stations to our roster, said Graves. We're looking for dedicated new members willing to train to become net control operators, NCOs. While being bilingual is not a requirement, being fluent in Spanish and English or French Creole and English is a plus. While HWN membership is required to serve as a net control station, radio amateurs do not need to be net members to participate as HWN reporting stations that provide observed or measured weather reports or relay assistance as required by the HWN net control. The net generally activates whenever a storm system has achieved a hurricane status and within 300 miles of a populated landmass, but this can vary due to the forward speed and intensity of the storm or the request of the forecasters at the National Hurricane Center. Once activated, the Hurricane WatchNet operates 24/7 on 14.325 megahertz during the day and 7.268 megahertz at night until a storm is no longer a threat to life and property. Hurricanes can and do make landfall at night, added Graves. The HWN cannot assign net controllers responsibilities on a specific timetable, but must be prepared to work as a cohesive unit, passing control as the situation dictates and keeping the net available for as much time as it takes to get the job done. At this time, there's a real need for stations located in the middle to western sections of the U.S., Canada, Central America, and throughout the Caribbean. Those who are fully bilingual, fluent in Spanish and English or French Creole and English, and stations who can help with overnight operations, midnight to 7:30 a.m. Eastern Time. Not all applicants are accepted. One common reason is that when an applicant is from an area which is overcrowded with members, that's a good problem to have, said Graves. This does not mean, however, that an applicant may not be accepted in the future. The HWN will keep applications on file for future reference. More information on the net, including weather data on the tropics and more, please visit the HWN website, www.hwn.org. To read more about the HWN, its history and mission, visit the Hurricane WatchNet, who we are. I'm John Ross, KD8IDJ.
If you're interested in training to become a net control operator for the Hurricane WatchNet, please visit the Net Control information page on the Internet.
On Saturday, March 29th, the RSGB National Radio Center coordinator, Martin Baker, G0GMB, together with Andy Webster, G7UHN, from the Radio Communications Foundation, will be delivering a talk in the Fellowship Auditorium at the Bletchley Park Museum. The presentation will introduce people to the radio spectrum and how to get to grips with the fundamentals of radio transmission. The session is being delivered as part of the RSGB's ongoing strategy to promote amateur radio to wider audiences. The Society is pleased to announce that RSGB members who would like to attend the talk are able to benefit from a 10% discount, reducing the price to £1440. To find out more about this talk, go to the What's On section on the Bletchley Park website. If you'd like to visit the Bletchley Park Museum after the talk, don't forget that RSGB members can gain free entry by downloading a voucher from the RSGB website.
You are listening to This Week in Amateur Radio, available to download as a podcast from anywhere on the web podcasts are available.
United States Senators Roger Wicker of Mississippi and Richard Blumenthal of Connecticut, and Representatives August Pfluger of Texas and Joe Courtney, also of Connecticut, announced their joint reintroduction of legislation in the Senate and House to restore the right to amateur radio operators to install the antennas necessary to serve their communities. Homeowner association rules often prevent amateur radio operators from installing antennas at their homes, even though amateur radio has proven to be essential in emergencies and natural disasters, such as hurricanes, when other means of communication fail. Mississippians should have access to every possible means of warning for natural disasters, including amateur radio operators. In an emergency, those warnings can mean the difference between life and death, Senator Wicker said. The Amateur Radio Emergency Preparedness Act would remove unnecessary roadblocks that could help keep communities safe during emergencies like tornadoes, hurricanes, and fires. When disaster strikes, amateur radio operations provide vital, often life-saving information, which shouldn't be hindered by prohibitive rules or confusing approval processes. The Amateur Radio Emergency Preparedness Act eliminates obstacles for ham radio enthusiasts, allowing them to continue their communications and serve their communities in the face of emergencies, said Senator Blumenthal. Natural disasters and other emergency situations that hinder our regular lines of communication are unfortunately unavoidable, which is why we must bolster our emergency preparedness by removing the barriers amateur radio operators often run into when installing antennas. Amateur radio plays a vital role in public safety by delivering critical information to people at all times. My district is home to dozens of amateur radio operators ready to volunteer in the event of an emergency, and I am proud to lead this legislation, said Congressman August Pfluger. As we know from recent natural disasters, amateur radios in Connecticut can be a critical component of disaster response and emergency management. It is in our community's best interest that we give them the capabilities to operate at the highest level, and with the reintroduction of this bill, we have taken a strong step in that direction, said Congressman Courtney. The Amateur Radio Emergency Preparedness Act of 2025, H.R. 1094 and S. 459, would require homeowner associations to accommodate the needs of FCC-licensed amateur radio operators by prohibiting the enforcement of private land use restrictions that ban, prevent, or require the approval of the installation or use of amateur radio station antennas. Homeowner associations have often prevented installation and use of such antennas through private land use restrictions. This has hindered voluntary training for emergency situations and blocked access to necessary communications when disaster strikes. Among other provisions, this legislation would prohibit homeowner association rules that would prevent or ban amateur radio antennas, specifically an approval process for installing amateur radio antennas, and provide a federal private right of action to amateur radio operators in disputed cases. On behalf of America's amateur radio licensees, Rick Roderick, the president of the American Radio Relay League, reconfirmed the ARRL's full support for the passage of the Amateur Radio Emergency Preparedness Act of 2025 and extended his thanks and appreciation to Senators Wicker and Blumenthal and Congressmen Pfluger and Courtney for their unflagging leadership in the bipartisan effort to support and protect the rights of all amateur radio operators. The full text of the House version can be found on the House website under Bill number H.R. 1094.
Robert Nauman, W5OV, passed away at his home in Texas on February 10, 2025. Nauman was a mentor to many in the amateur radio service and well known in the ham radio contesting and DX community. He served on the headquarters staff of ARRL, the National Association for Amateur Radio, as Director of Operations from 2021 to 2024. He was an ARRL Life member and a member of the ARRL Diamond Club. ARRL Chief Executive Officer David Minster, NA2AA, has known Nauman for decades. Bob was a very passionate supporter of amateur radio, and especially ARRL. He said on many occasions that working at headquarters was a dream come true, wrote Minster in a message to ARRL staff. In his writing, Nauman recounted that he earned his amateur radio license as a teenager in 1973 as WN2OVE, but his fascination and exploration with radio began even earlier. Those GE walkie-talkies I received as a Christmas gift from my parents when I was about 9 years old was what really lured me in. I was fascinated about how one could communicate through the air using these simple 9-volt battery-powered devices, he wrote. Nauman had many friends around the world through amateur radio. He achieved ARRL DXCC Honor Roll and was a long-serving member of the CQ Worldwide DX Contest Committee. He operated from several Caribbean islands, including Antigua, where he held the call sign V260, and previously V26RN, and Bonaire, where he operated as PJ4/W5OV. In the United States, he noted on his QRZ profile that he has operated from the Smithsonian Institution station NN3SI, the United Nations headquarters station 4U1UN, and the station aboard the Queen Mary W6RO. Nauman enjoyed trips to the Ham Radio Exposition in Friedrichshafen, Germany. Throughout his professional career, he worked for Electronic Data Systems, Citigroup Financial, and held positions in the amateur radio industry. Outpourings of support and remembrance for Nauman have been seen on social media pages, Ham Club email reflectors, and online message boards. Bob was only 66 years old and has left us far too early in life, continued the message from Minster.
Amateur Radio Emergency Services, or ARES, in the ARRL Puerto Rico section have signed a renewal Memorandum of Understanding, or MOU, with the American Red Cross Puerto Rico region. John Ross, KD8 IDJ, is here with more.
The agreement establishes a framework of cooperation and a close working relationship with ARRL ARES volunteers. Both ARES and the Red Cross agree that with resources that both of the organizations have, the public will be best served during disasters, emergencies, and other public service-related situations. ARRL Puerto Rico Section Manager Carmen N. Green, KB4QVQ, believes the new MOU benefits everyone. The renewal of the existing MOU with the American Red Cross of Puerto Rico is a testament to the relationship and commitment we have at the local section level with the legendary organization, she said. We feel that our communities will greatly benefit from the joint efforts to train and practice the ability to pass messages when the normal infrastructure is not available. I'm John Ross, KD8IDJ.
She added that as new section manager, it feels great to have this experience with an important organization, as well as having great contact with all the hams around the island. You can read the entire Memorandum of Understanding on the League's website.
It is time for this week's AMSAT satellite shorts from all over, and this week we find that NASA has confirmed the crew for Axiom Mission 4, set to launch no earlier than spring 2025 aboard a SpaceX Dragon spacecraft from Kennedy Space Center. The mission will be commanded by former astronaut Peggy Whitson, with ISRO astronaut Shubhanshu Shukla
as pilot and ESA's Shavos Uznański-Wisniewski and Hungary's Tibor Kapu as mission specialists. Once docked at the International Space Station, the crew will spend up to 14 days conducting science, outreach, and commercial activities. This mission includes the first ISRO astronaut aboard the station and the first astronauts from Poland and Hungary to stay there. NASA sees private astronaut missions as a way to expand access to space and support commercial activity in low Earth orbit. As the agency shifts focus to deep space exploration through Artemis missions, partnerships with private companies help maintain a human presence in space and support research in microgravity. And lastly this week, AO-73 was switched back to full-time transponder mode on February 3, 2025. The UV linear transponder is now operating 24/7 after a month-long period of telemetry collection on the satellite's electrical power system. While some signs of reduced battery capacity are present, the two lithium-ion cells continue to perform well, supporting full transponder operation throughout the orbit. AO-73 features an inverting SSB and CW transponder with an uplink passband from 435.150 to 435.130 MHz lower sideband and a downlink passband from 145.950 to 145.970 MHz upper sideband. With the transponder active, the satellite also transmits BPSK telemetry on 145.935 MHz at 40 milliwatts. The collected telemetry data helps assess the long-term health of the 11-year-old satellite.
You're listening to This Week in Amateur Radio, available worldwide as a podcast from our web at www.twiar.net.
Over a year and a half after launch, SO-120, or Eurosat-1, has finally deployed its antennas. Jan PE0SAT discovered the signal of SO-120 on January 28th, and telemetry confirmed that the satellite was showing that the antennas were deployed. SO-120 was launched on June 12, 2023. On January 31st, AMSAT-EA managed to activate the repeater of SO-120, but in its secondary uplink frequency of 145.925 MHz. No subtone required. Downlink working well on 436.888 MHz. The VHF antenna seems not fully deployed, as it can be seen in the SSTV images received are showing just a yellow color, which is the VHF antenna over the camera lens. SSTV images are transmitted in Robot 36. As the VHF antenna is not fully deployed, the FM repeater requires a strong uplink signal to break the squelch. The satellite also can play chess. AMSAT-EA will send chess moves suggested via @AMSAT Spain on X. Help is requested by receiving the chess telemetry.
The RSGB has launched a new webpage on how emerging technology can be used in amateur radio. Technologies such as artificial intelligence and 3D printing offer the opportunity to broaden the definition of amateur radio. They can also increase appeal and attract a more diverse audience. For existing radio amateurs, they offer the opportunity for progression through learning new skills. You'll also find links to 2 RSGB convention presentations, including the newly released talk on 3D printing by Tom Wardell, 2E0JJI. The Society will be adding more technologies to the webpage in the coming months and would love to hear from you if you're involved in amateur radio in any of these areas. Share your stories via comms, COMMS, at rsgb.org.uk.
A SpaceX Falcon 9 rocket launched SiriusXM's latest satellite recently. Built by Maxar Space Systems using its Maxar 1300 platform, SXM-9 is more than 27 feet tall and approximately 100 feet long with its solar arrays deployed. At launch, it weighed around 6,400 kilograms. The satellite features an S-band reflector antenna supplied by L3 Harris. The geostationary satellite will be a twin high-powered digital audio-radio satellite built on Maxar's proven 1300-class platform at the company's manufacturing facilities in Palo Alto and San Jose, California, the two companies said in an announcement. In December, the company announced a renewed emphasis on in-car listening after previously focusing on streaming. SiriusXM said it reaches approximately 160 million equipped vehicles. Subscribers likely won't notice any difference while listening on the road, but the media provider stated the satellite strengthens its coverage across the contiguous United States, Puerto Rico, and Canada. Bridget Neville, SiriusXM's Senior Vice President and General Manager of Signal Distribution Engineering, said in a statement that the launch is expected to enhance the health of its satellite fleet for the foreseeable future. The company's fleet includes multiple active satellites as well as an in-orbit spare. SiriusXM plans to launch its SXM-10 satellite later this year, with SXM-11 and SXM-12 in development, though their launch timelines are yet to be determined.
Blue Origin successfully launched its NS-29 mission on February 4th, marking a significant milestone in suborbital research. The mission, which lifted off from the company's West Texas launch site at 1600 UTC, was originally scheduled for January 28th, but was delayed due to weather and technical issues. This flight was the 29th for the reusable new Shepard vehicle and featured a unique capability, the simulation of lunar gravity in suborbital space. The NS-29 mission proceeded as planned, with both the booster and the crew capsule executing safe returns to Earth. The booster performed a controlled vertical landing on a designated pad, while the capsule descended under parachutes, touching down in the West Texas desert approximately 10 minutes after launch. However, one of the capsule's 3 parachutes did not fully open. Blue Origin officials assured viewers during the live broadcast that the spacecraft is designed to land safely, even if not all parachutes fully deploy. A key feature of this mission was its ability to generate lunar gravity forces, the first for New Shepard. The capsule achieved this by rotating about 11 times per minute for 2 minutes using its rotation control thrusters. This capacity was developed to support research on lunar-related technologies benefiting the 30 payloads aboard the spacecraft. Among these, 29 experiments were specifically designed to test innovations applicable to the Moon's environment. Blue Origin categorized these experiments into 6 focus areas: in situ resource utilization, dust migration, advanced habitation systems, sensors and instrumentation, small spacecraft technologies, and entry, descent, and landing methods. Many of these experiments were backed by NASA's Flight Opportunities Program, underscoring the space agency's commitment to developing technology for lunar exploration. With the Artemis program aiming for long-term human presence on the Moon, missions like NS-29 provide valuable data to refine critical systems for future lunar operations. Notable NASA-supported experiments aboard NS-29 include the Electrostatic Dust Lofting Project, which examined how lunar dust becomes electrically charged and moves when exposed to ultraviolet light. Another key experiment, the Lunar G Combustion Investigation, studied 5 behaviors in lunar gravity compared to Earth's, helping to enhance safety in future lunar habitats. Other experiments tested propellant management in low gravity, soil analysis tools, and small satellite propulsion systems, all contributing to advancing space exploration technologies. New Shepard, named after astronaut Alan Shepard, has been operational since its first uncrewed flight in April 2015. The vehicle made history in 2021 by carrying Jeff Bezos and 3 others on its first crewed flight. While primarily known for space tourism, with 9 of its 29 flights carrying passengers, the system continues to play a critical role in scientific research. The successful NS-29 mission not only demonstrated Blue Origin's ability to simulate lunar gravity, but also reinforced its contribution to advancing space technology in support of NASA's lunar ambitions.
The Charleston Amateur Radio Club, KB3CAN, has an outlook that is anything but retiring. With only a small membership and a Maryland retirement community, the club recently completed Winter Field Day with 95 digital and SSB contacts in the log. Last summer, members were active in ARRL Field Day and the Maryland QSO Party. The club has something else to celebrate: the second year since its rebirth on the grounds of the Charleston Senior Living, a nonprofit retirement community in suburban Catonsville that provides continuing care ranging from independent living to skilled nursing. Club president Gary Rogers, KO3F, said that although the community has a long history of having an amateur radio club, the original club had to be dismantled more than a decade ago to accommodate building renovations. When Gary moved there in 2022 and discovered that his apartment's construction made it difficult to get on the air easily, he met with 2 members of the original club to start things up again. Gary went on to say in an email that the administration wasn't just on board but became part of the rebirth. He said the administration not only approved but assigned their maintenance staff to run the coax through the conduit to the roof and install the antennas, with me supervising. Installations were completed by November of 2023, everything from the grounding system to ensuring the roof warranty was not compromised by the presence of antennas. There are 10 club members ranging from their 70s to their 90s. Gary said the club recently developed the capability to do WinLink, a global email system that uses radio frequencies instead of the internet. The club's next step is to explore how members can get on the air remotely from their individual apartments.
You are listening to This Week in Amateur Radio, available to download as a podcast from anywhere on the web podcasts are available.
The Haight amateur radio satellite, operated by AMSAT-EA, has been successfully deployed and it's functioning as expected. According to AMSAT-EA's update on January 23, the satellite is transmitting telemetry data, and the initial health reports indicate it's in good condition. The team is actively receiving data and preparing to transition the satellite into repeater mode once all necessary checks are complete. Amateur radio operators worldwide are encouraged to share their telemetry reports to assist in confirming its operational status. Deployment occurred on January 22 at 1542 UTC from the D-Orbit Ion SCV-016 orbital transfer vehicle after launching on January 14 aboard the SpaceX Falcon 9 rocket as part of the Transporter 12 mission from Vandenberg Air Force Base. The mission carried 131 payloads, including amateur radio satellites Hades R and Paris T1. Due to the large number of satellites on board, deployments were staggered over several days. Early signals were reported by amateur operators, but official confirmation came from AMSAT-EA following later. The transmissions began shortly after deployment through the FM repeater remains inactive as testing and validation procedures continue. Designed to provide FM voice repeater capabilities, the satellite also supports various digital modes, including FSK telemetry and APRS set up at 1200 BPS. This features a download frequency of 436.888 MHz and is coordinated by the International Amateur Radio Union. While FM voice is at its primary mission, it will also transmit experimental data and FSK telemetry. The uplink frequency is 145.925 MHz, supporting FM voice and various digital modes, including AX25 and APRS. The FM repeater will operate without requiring a subtone, activating it via squelch level. As part of AMSAT-EA's ongoing efforts to expand amateur radio satellite operations, this spacecraft is the first of its planned replacements for Hades D, or SO-121. The second, Hades ICM, is expected to launch on the upcoming Transporter 13 mission. Both satellites will provide FM and digital communication options, allowing amateur operators to engage in long-distance contacts. Additionally, Hades ICM will host an experimental payload from the University of Manchester's Smart IR Graphene Engineering Innovation Center, testing low-power active radiators under space conditions. AMSAT-EA has urged amateur radio communities to continue monitoring transmissions and sharing received telemetry data as the satellite progresses towards its full operational capabilities.
Interloon, a Seattle-based startup founded by former Blue Origin technologists, is aiming to harvest helium-3 from the moon to support quantum computing applications here on Earth. Helium-3, a rare isotope deposited into the lunar regolith by solar wind, was first identified in samples brought back by NASA's Apollo missions. While the potential applications of helium-3 have intrigued scientists for years, recent archaeological research highlights significant challenges in extracting the isotope. The U.S. Geological Survey suggests that obtaining commercially viable amounts would require processing millions of tons of lunar regolith, a task comparable to large-scale mining operations here on Earth. Despite these hurdles, Interloon CEO Rob Meyerson remains optimistic. The company envisions an extraction system operating much like an agricultural setup, with 5 harvesters, each the size of a large SUV. Meyerson acknowledges that it'll take years before the company sees a financial return, but he emphasizes the growing demand for helium-3 in quantum computing. The isotope plays a critical role in cooling superconducting quantum computers to temperatures close to absolute zero. With quantum computing companies recognizing the need for a stable helium-3 supply, Interloon believes now is the time to act. Interloon is not the first to consider the commercial potential of lunar helium-3. Apollo 17 astronaut and Interloon's executive chairman, Jack Schmidt, long has advocated its use in nuclear fission reactors. However, investment interest has shifted towards quantum computing applications, which promise quicker returns. And beyond that, helium-3 has other potential uses, including medical imaging and radiation detection. Interloon hopes to eventually supply tens of kilograms per year, a goal that Meyerson believes is both realistic and financially sustainable, given current market prices up around $20 million per kilogram. However, some experts remain skeptical about the feasibility of large-scale helium-3 extraction from the moon. Laszlo Cathili, a research geologist at the USGS Astrogeology Science Center, notes lunar helium-3 concentrations range from just 2.4 to 26 parts per billion in Apollo samples. Now, given these figures, obtaining a single kilogram would require processing between 100,000 and 1 million tons of lunar soil. Cathili stopped short of dismissing the endeavor outright, saying, "The moon does contain resources. It's merely a question of how they can be effectively utilized." To address these concerns, Interloon is planning a research development mission in 2027 to analyze helium-3 concentrations at a potential mining site. The mission will be followed by a pilot plant in 2029 to demonstrate extraction and processing on the lunar surface. The company's initial lunar mission will launch through NASA's Commercial Lunar Payload Systems Initiative. Interloon is actively securing funding, having already raised $18 million with plans for another round of fundraising coming in the near future. While profitability remains uncertain, experts acknowledge that Interloon's success will depend on the efficiency of its extraction methods. Chris Dreyer from the Colorado School of Mines notes that certain minerals trap more helium-3 than others, potentially increasing yield in select locations. However, large-scale excavation will be necessary, posing technical challenges, particularly with lunar dust. And despite these obstacles, Dreyer believes iterative development, designing, testing, and improving equipment could make Interloon's ambitions feasible. As advances in space exploration continue, the prospect of mining helium-3 on the moon is becoming an increasingly tangible reality.
As an amateur astronomer and astrophotographer, Dada VU2 DSI enjoys catching meteors with the lens of his telescopes or camera. As an amateur radio operator, he also chases after them with his radio signal. Here on Earth, he often shares his love of the heavens with students by presenting skywatching programs in schools and colleges around India. So when a meteorite falls to Earth, as it did millions of years ago, Dada is not likely to ignore what it left behind. He has traveled to Lunar Lake in the Buldana district of India's Maharashtra state for his first-time encounter with what he calls an astronomical wonder, the crater that the massive impact left behind, with the meteor buried 600 meters below. Researchers from the Physical Research Laboratory of India, the Smithsonian Institution, and the Geological Society of India have probed its mysteries. Now it is Dada's turn to do some exploring. At the edge of the crater, he hopes to discover the wonder and the appeal it holds for amateurs around the world. Using the call sign AU6LON, Dada is calling CQ from Lunar Meteor Lake. Operating from what has since been declared a wildlife sanctuary, he will call CQ from the 20th through to the 24th of February. He will be joined by two other radio enthusiasts, Ujay, VU3LPQ, and Suhos, a shortwave listener. QSL information and other details about the activation can be found on the QRZ.com page of AU6LON.
If you've got your eye on the World Radio Sport Team Championship 2026 in the United Kingdom, you may want to read the competition rules, which have just been published by the Championships Committee. The rules have been adjusted slightly from the previous competition to ensure that this is a fair test of operator skills. Questions may be submitted to the committee via social media, on the World Radio Sport Team Championship Reflector, or at amateur radio conventions.
Coming up on our 26th year keeping the amateur radio community around the world informed, you are listening to This Week in Amateur Radio. Available worldwide as a podcast from our web at twiar.net.
FRAM-2 is a pioneering private astronaut mission, the first to fly astronauts over the North and South Poles. FRAM-2 will give the 4 onboard astronauts unprecedented first views of the polar regions from space. While astronauts on the ISS can see a large portion of the Earth, it is not possible to see these upper regions of Earth from the ISS. FRAM-2 is planned to be launched no later than March 1, 2025, and is planning a 3-day mission with an optional 2-day extension. The amateur radio experimental payload on FRAM-2, called Fram-to-Ham, is also pioneering in nature. It represents the first use of human spaceflight amateur radio in polar orbit and the first amateur radio transmissions from a SpaceX Dragon capsule. Fram-to-Ham operations are being performed by private astronaut Rabea Roge, amateur radio call signs LB9NJ from Norway, and KB3AID from the United States. Fram-to-Ham will transmit slow-scan television picture images from space to radio receivers on the ground as part of a high school and university student competition. These SSTV images can also be received by radio enthusiasts worldwide and posted to the ARIS SSTV gallery, but with a twist. Images posted will not be shown until after the FRAM-2 mission. These operations support the Youth SSTV competition, where they are to acquire several SSTV puzzle pieces, assemble the puzzle, determine the polar location, and answer questions related to that location. Operations frequency will be 437.550 MHz. Using the SSTV plan for Fram-to-Ham, ground users can practice the more challenging 70-centimeter Doppler correction. SSTV mode will be PD120. The longer image capture for this simulation will allow ground users to hone their signal polarization switching skills, both manually and electronically, as well as precise antenna pointing. Operations duration will be from February 13th, which is World Radio Day, to February 17th, 2025. This long duration over a weekend will allow users multiple passes to practice, learn lessons, make corrections, and try again. For more information on the FRAM-2 mission and for youth organizations interested in participating in the Fram-to-Ham SSTV competition, visit framtoham.com. ARIS also has a FRAM-2 tab on its website, www.ariss.org.
For our final story this week comes word that the MP3 file format was always encumbered with patents, but as of 2017, the last patent finally expired. Although the format became synonymous with the digital music revolution that started in the late 1990s as an audio compression format, there is an argument to be made that it has long since been superseded by better formats and other changes. Ibrahim Diallo makes that very argument in a recent blog post. In a world with super-fast internet speeds and the abstracting away of music formats behind streaming services, few people still care about MP3. The last patents for the MP3 format expired in 2012 in the European Union and 2017 in the US, ending many years of incessant legal sniping. For those of us learning of the wonders of MP3 back around 1998 through services like Napster or LimeWire, MP3s meant downloading music on 56K dial-up in a matter of minutes to hours rather than days to weeks with WAVE, and with generally better quality than Microsoft's WMA format at lower bit rates. When portable media players came onto the scene, they were called MP3 players, a name that stuck around. But is MP3 really obsolete and best forgotten in the dustbin of history at this point? Would anyone care if computers drop support for MP3 tomorrow? While FLAC and Ogg Vorbis are truly open formats, they're not as widely supported by devices. Much like VGA, MP3 isn't so much sticking around because it's a superior technological solution, but because it just works anywhere, unlike fancier formats. From dollar store MP3 players to budget boomboxes to high-end audio gear, they'll all play MP3s just fine. Other formats are likely to be a gamble at best. This compatibility alone means that MP3 is hard to dislodge, with formats like Ogg Vorbis trying to do so for decades and still being relatively unknown and poorly supported, especially when considering hardware implementations. But let's talk about audio quality for a second. Since the average person is not an audiophile who is concerned with exact audio reproduction and can hear every audio compression artifact, MP3 is still perfectly fine in an era where the Bluetooth SBC codec is what most people seem to be content with. In that sense, listening to 320 kilobits per second variable bitrate MP3 files with wired headphones is a superior experience over listening to FLAC files with the Bluetooth SBC codec in between. This leads to another point. The average person does not deal with files anymore. Many people use online applications for everything from multimedia to documents, which happily abstract away the experience of managing file formats. Yet, at the same time, there's a resurgence of interest in physical media and owning a physical copy of content, which means dealing with files. We see this also with MP3 players. Even though companies like Apple, who abandoned their iPod range, and Sony, whose current Walkmans are mostly rebranded Android smartphones with the phone part stripped out, plenty of portable media players are still available brand new. People want portable access to their media in any format.
This Week in Amateur Radio is holding open auditions for news anchors for the weekly national worldwide amateur radio news service. If you have a good radio voice and can reliably read provided news copy, we are looking for you. This, of course, is an all-volunteer position. An amateur radio license is not required. You must have a high-quality microphone, headset mics are not used, and be familiar with audio editing software to record and edit your finished news stories before uploading. If you would like to try out for a weekly or bi-weekly anchor position with North America's premier amateur radio news on air and podcast, please send an email to our producer, George, W2XBS. You can include a sample MP3 of yourself reading news copy sent as an attachment to W2XBS77@gmail.com. That's whiskey, the number 2, X-ray Bravo Sierra 77@gmail.com. Be sure and use Anchor Audition in the subject line. Please include your phone number and a good window of time for a callback to discuss your submission and our operating logistics to see if This Week in Amateur Radio is a good fit for you. We hope to hear from you soon. This Week in Amateur Radio is streamed on the internet, broadcast on low-power FM, and heard on nets and repeaters all around the world, like the K2IWR repeater operated by the Skyline Amateur Radio Club on 147.180 MHz in Cortland, New York, where This Week in Amateur Radio is heard each Tuesday evening at 8:30 p.m. Eastern. If you would like to have your club's repeater announced on This Week in Amateur Radio, send us an email with all the pertinent information to w2xbs77@gmail.com. Many of the news and information items heard in this edition of This Week in Amateur Radio have been provided by the American Radio Relay League, the ARRL Audio News Service, and the ARRL Letter, AMSAT, the Radio Amateurs of Canada, the Shortwave Listening Post, the Federal Communications Commission, the Radio Society of Great Britain, and Ofcom, the South African Radio League, the International Amateur Radio Union, the Wireless Institute of Australia and the Australian Communications and Media Authority, the New Zealand Association of Radio Transmitters, the Amateur Radio Newsline, the Rain Hamcast, Eric Guth, 4Z1UG and QSO Today, QRZ.com, the International Telecommunications Union, the 425DX News, Parks on the Air, and the Soda Reflector, and various news sources on the Internet.
With special thanks to all our weekly news sources and to you, our listeners, that wraps up this edition of This Week in Amateur Radio. If you'd like to write to us, you can find everything you need, including archive editions of the news service, at our website at twiar.net. And now, for all of us at This Week in Amateur Radio headquarters and our news team around the world, this is Chris Perrine, KB2FAF, wishing you a 73.